In the previous lesson, we learned how to configure our Nginx processes for the best performance. So in this lesson, we'll take a slightly more detailed look at optimizing those processes by configuring buffer sizes and timeouts. This time round, instead of adding these configurations during the lesson, I've added them in advance as there's nothing really to demonstrate. If you want to copy these into your own configuration as a starting point, the file is linked in the resources as with previous lessons. Now, before I start explaining the function of these additions, please note that whilst configuring processes is a fairly easy and measurable task, buffer sizes and timeouts is the complete opposite. This being as they're not so much dependent on the server, but more the nature of the requests to the server. In fact, I'd suggest leaving these as their default values if you're unsure about why you're tweaking them at all. Nonetheless, it's very important to understand the important ones and know how to change them should you ever need to. First up then, let's discuss in brief what a buffer is. Buffering is when a process, or an Nginx worker in this case, reads data into memory, or RAM, before writing it to its next destination. For example, Nginx receives a request which it reads from a TCP port 80 in this case, writes that request data to memory, which is buffering, or if the buffer is too small for the amount of data being read, writes some of it to disk. The opposite of this then is that Nginx responds to a request with, say, a static file, which it reads from disk into memory, so buffering the file, and sends that data to the client from memory. This happens, as the name implies, to create a buffer or layer of protection between reading and writing of data. A process which can get extremely complicated, but for the purposes of configuring Nginx, just have an understanding of what it is in order to better understand configuring these directives. Timeouts are pretty self-explanatory. They simply suggest a cutoff time for a given event. For example, if receiving a request from a client, stop after a certain number of seconds, thus preventing a client from sending an endless stream of data and eventually breaking the server. Okay, the first directive we have here then, in the HTTP context, so essentially applying to our entire configuration, is the client body buffer size. This directive then setting the amount of memory to allocate for buffering the post data from a client. Post data most likely coming from a form submission, which in this case is set to 10K or 10 kilobytes. For data sizes, Nginx supports a plain number, for example 100, which would equate to bytes. 10K, as we have it here, which equates to kilobytes, or 10M for megabytes. These can be written as either upper or lowercase. I've linked to the documentation for these unit syntaxes in the resources. So why 10K then? Well, in this case, no reason other than a basic form submission should be well under that. Increasing this number to more than what we need will allocate and essentially waste memory on our server. And making it too small will require Nginx to write part of this buffer to disk, which is a lot slower than writing it to memory. Your website might very well rely on much larger form submissions, in which case you'll definitely want to increase this. Again, very specific to the nature of requests your server is likely to receive. Second then, we have client max body size, set to 8 megabytes, meaning don't accept post requests of more than 8 megabytes. If it is larger than 8 meg, the server will respond with a 413 error, which is request entity too large. Again, this being a safety measure to ensure a user doesn't mistakenly or maliciously send a very large post request, which could cause the server to slow down, use up a lot of disk space, etc. 8 meg being a fairly safe limit that should still allow most standard images to be uploaded and so on. Those two directives dealing with post requests, the next one is the client header buffer size. As the name suggests, the amount of memory to allocate to reading request headers. 1 kilobyte being more than enough for 99% of requests. Headers typically being a small amount of data. Then, still fine-tuning incoming requests, we have the two major client timeouts. Client body timeout and client header timeout, both of which I have set to a very short 12 milliseconds. Importantly, in this case, the body timeout does not refer to the time it takes to transmit the entire request body, but rather the time between consecutive read operations, those reads that happen to the buffer. Both of these default to 60 seconds, which in my opinion is way too long, but again, feel free to adjust as you see fit. As before, Nginx allows us to set times as either a number only, like this, which indicates milliseconds, with an S for seconds, all the way up to years, which will obviously not ever be applicable to directives such as these timeouts. Next, we have the very important keep alive timeout. This directive sets the amount of time Nginx should keep a connection to a client open for in case more data is on the way. This is extremely useful when, say, a client is requesting a number of files, and keeping a connection open reduces the time it takes to open another new connection. Equally, not wanting to leave connections open for too long, as this can result in our pool of max connections, this times this, being used up. Unlikely, but quite disastrous should it happen. For the most part, there's no reason a connection would have to stay open beyond a few milliseconds before continuing, and most clients will close connections properly, meaning this timeout won't even apply. But given you have the server resources, feel free to increase this number to even a couple of seconds. And our last timeout being the all-important send timeout, meaning if a client does not receive any of the response data in this amount of time, doesn't have to be all of the response data, but none of it at all, abort sending the response altogether. The last two directives I have here is somewhat unique, and for the vast majority of web servers will provide a decent increase in performance. Send file, meaning when sending a client data from disk, so typically a static file like an image, etc., don't use a buffer. Read that data from the disk and write it directly to the response, with TCP no push enabling Nginx to optimize the size of those data packets being sent to the client. Two very simple but incredibly valuable directives that will especially help optimize sites with a large number of static resources. That wraps up the basics of buffers and timeouts, and whilst this might be the most difficult aspect of an Nginx configuration to really fine-tune, I'd encourage you to give it a go, but not worry about it too much. Most clients will open and close connections correctly without the need to be timed out or rejected.